Our second speaker is Brian Martin. And Brian Martin is a native of the metropolitan city of Tijuana in Mexico, concluding a multi-year journey full of financial obstacles, daily struggles, and student debt. Right, Brian? Just as much as it is also full of social and political activism, intellectual growth, and personal development. Brian will be completing a bachelor's degree in cultural studies later this year. Brian's academic work is at the intersection of critical geography, critical race theory, and critical pedagogies, especially as these fields affect lower-income Black and Brown communities. These interests have earned Brian a fellowship with the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy, which he will begin this summer. They love their mother and sister with the force of 1,001 poems about fire and passion. So now to the title of Brian's presentation, The University as Settler Colony, Gentrification and the Racialization of Space in the Construction of the University of Illinois at Chicago. In this critical intervention, Brendan Martin approaches the modern urban university as a state apparatus which reproduces dominant racially exclusive notions of property derivative of settler colonialism. Using the University of Illinois at Chicago as a case study, Martin examines the processes of urban renewal and the elimination of white ethnic, Mexican, and Black communities in the near west side of Chicago. They assert the university's central role in the reconstruction of Chicago's white urban space economy, thus challenging the common sense notion that the only social function of the urban university is the production of knowledge. Rather, Martin argues, the neoliberal university also serves the function of gentrification and the commodification of neighborhoods. Without further ado, our second speaker, Brian Martin.
Ooh. Is this working? Is this mic on? This is kind of short. Hi, thank you for lasting through all this. And it would make me feel better if we have a collective sigh or breath before I begin. Can we do that on 3? 1, 2, 3. It's like music. Okay. So July of 2014, the Washington Post published an article titled, "A Nationwide Gentrification Effect is Segregating Us by Gentrification." This article posed that in 2000, college graduates could expect to earn about 57% more than non-college graduates. By 2011, 73%. As the returns to education have increased, according to Stanford economist Rebecca Diamond, the geographic segregation of the most educated workers has too, and not merely by neighborhood, but by entire city. The larger the share of a city's workforce that's made up of college graduates, the more expensive it is to live there. By Diamond's calculation, for every 1% increase in a city's ratio of college graduates to non-graduates, the city experiences a 0.6 increase in rents. Apparently, there is a kind of person whose presence heightens property value. And I'm hesitant to say that kind of person is only a college graduate. Looking at gentrification neighborhood by neighborhood, we notice that increases in property values historically correlate with an influx, or more comically, a reflux, of white suburbanites after World War II. While I want to provide a bunch of statistics or theories on how a big part of white suburban culture is actually attending universities or accumulating cultural capital in the image of Matthew Arnold, that is not this capstone. But I can argue that urban-situated universities themselves have had a hand in the restructuring of cities through gentrification and urban renewal projects. In fact, that expansions of universities in USA's urban centers after World War II had the explicit purpose, beyond or despite their educational function. In this analysis, I want to intervene on the common sense that the university is purely a benign set of classrooms where students are molded into highly skilled citizens, or where the newest, most helpful medical advancements occur. I want us to also consider the effect that the structures of universities, their physical buildings, and their dependence on an economy of space and real estate have on the city's inhabitants. Indeed, on the work of its students and faculty. I think that if we look citywide, we can find that where universities expand, as do property values. And as property values expand, lower income people, especially people of color, are pushed out. Gentrification can be described as a set of processes in which capital is reinvested in neighborhoods, usually those that have experienced a period of disinvestment, to create spaces that appeal to wealthier groups of people, often whites. Most analyses of gentrification coincide with junctures of urban in-migration, such as post-World War I Great Migration from the South, Mexican immigrants in the 1980s, World War II Great Migration, so on. However, much of this literature emphasizes what they presume to be a universally determining class structure in lieu of race. For example, Neil Smith and Michel Lefebvre theorized the devalorization cycle where a set of economic processes such as new construction, landlord control, blockbusting, redlining, and abandonment are employed to deteriorate the values of neighborhoods. This analysis is important in that it contests the idea that neighborhood succession is a consequence of an invisible hand, but does little to accommodate the impetus for gentrification beyond counteracting falling rates of profit. For Smith and Lefebvre, the working class is struggling against the interests of capital. But what happens when capital's interests include maintaining the whiteness of the city because that whiteness is itself profitable? What happens when redlining, blockbusting, and predatory landlord control are used disproportionately on black residents? The class analysis of gentrification must then be edited to accommodate the racialized production of Chicago's space. Here, we will be focusing on the production of space during World War II urban renewal, or post-World War II urban renewal. So from the 1940s to the 1960s, Chicago's efforts to reconstruct the spatial economy through gentrification revealed an economy of racism. This economy positioned poor black migrants and their cultural practices as undesirable, and white migrants and their culture, and white suburbanites and their cultural practices as desirable. To put it in David Harvey's terms, the conceived space of urban renewal was and is structured by what George Lipschitz calls a possessive investment in whiteness, where whiteness is a valuable form of property. At the other end of this, black people, especially poor black people, are racialized in such a way that they inhibit the creation of property values. Their presence was equated to what Chicago's legislators and sociologists dubbed blight. For example, in Chapter 5 of Making the Second Ghetto, titled A Neighborhood Upon a Hill, gesturing to John Winthrop's City Upon a Hill, Arnold R. Hirsch provides a critical account of the University of Chicago's efforts to reconstruct the neighborhood of Hyde Park Kenwood. Concerned with maintaining a compatible environment for its operations in light of mass influxes of poor black migrants, the university harnessed the power of city and state legislature. Through the eminent domain powers the Blighted Areas Act of 1947 had extended to corporations, the university acquired properties to demolish and reconstruct in accordance with the city's redevelopment guidelines. However, Hirsch holds that through these efforts, the university, quote, the university tried to create an economically upgraded and predominantly white neighborhood, end quote. But, quote, if the racial homogeneity of the area could no longer be maintained, class could still be used to assure the quality of those non-whites permitted to remain. The architects of Hyde Park's redevelopment plan, people like the University of Chicago's Chancellor, Lawrence A. Kimpton, viewed class as, quote, an effective screening tool for cutting down the number of Negroes. And this is a direct quote from a meeting with Kimpton. Ironically, in the process of demolishing blighted areas, the university would end up displacing many more lower-income white residents than it would black. But the willingness of the university to dispossess lower-income whites is not evidence of benevolent attitude towards black people. The university's principal concern was pushing out the small black population already in their neighborhood and keeping out new migrants. Furthermore, the category of blight itself is racialized, even synonymous with blackness in the urban context. Derived from an ecological approach of Chicago school sociologists, blight was meant to designate a sort of disease in city structures evident in low property value. These sociologists especially noted the disturbances of metabolism caused by an excessive increase in population, such as that which followed the great influx of Negroes after World War I. Within the framework of blight, overcrowding, dilapidation, and mortality rates were incidents to be blamed on the behaviors of residents themselves. The government which used methods of blockbusting and redlining, the government which supported predatory landlords in packing their buildings with desperate black residents, the government which hence produced the condition of blight was not held responsible for the suffering of inhabitants of Chicago. In fact, this government was allowed to solve the problem by subordinating the powers of eminent domain to Chicago's private interests. But most audaciously, they announced this solution as public purpose. The Blighted Areas Redevelopment Act, the Urban Community Conservation Act, and the Relocation Act, enactments which created a legislative framework for urban renewal to be appropriated nationally, cited themselves as working in the public good insofar as they cleared the spread of disease, crime, infant mortality, and halted a menace to the health, safety, morals, and welfare of its residents. These are direct quotes from their preambles. Thus, the enactments justified the destruction of poor households and the displacements of lower income people, especially black people. Simultaneously, they re-racialize blackness as blighted, destructive to property values, and thus a public menace. But gentrification is not only the displacement of black bodies, it is the elimination of ways of life. Thousands of black migrants had escaped the lawless white kleptocracy of the Jim Crow South in hopes of a better life in Chicago, finding violent opposition from the city's white residents and its political elite. Against these odds, they established communities in the city. In my project, I focused on the near west side of Chicago, which we now might all know as UIC, or the University Village. And this was the neighborhood with the first integrated public housing in the city of Chicago. This was the neighborhood where Muddy Waters, Little Richard, and the like began their careers. This is a neighborhood with over 100,000 residents, mostly Black and Mexican by 1960. Within a few years, with the decisions of a minority in power, most of this community was eliminated to construct UIC's campus. As of 2010, the population of the near west side has become 42% white and increasingly middle to upper class. New construction and investments are pushing at the edges of the university, raising the rents of historically working class communities like Pilsen and Little Village and so on. These developments beg the question Neil Smith asks in the introduction of Yuppies and Housing. Why do central and inner areas of cities, which for decades could not satisfy the demands of the white middle class, now appear to do so handsomely? In the case of the near west side and UIC, arguably the entire project of urban renewal, it is, if you build it, they will come. When the Massachusetts Bay Colony settled its city upon a hill, nearly 20,000 Puritans would arrive in the next 10 years. The colony needed only to eliminate the indigenous people and create a lucrative haven for white cultural practices, specifically the practice of extracting value from privatized land. The developments of urban renewal, including if not especially those surrounding the building of universities, engaged in very parallel processes to settler colonialism. I would claim that in expropriating land and dismantling communities of color for the sake of profit, they are reenacting the racialized violence which transpired in the founding of this country. But at no point did the university, its architects, or its proponents advertise its construction as a reenactment of the settler-colonist dynamic, and some universities actually did so proudly. Nor did they acknowledge the university as an instrument of urban renewal which sought to eliminate poor communities of color in the interest of maximizing property value. According to UIC's own campus tour, the University of Illinois at Chicago's Circle was one of several instant campuses built in response to major growth in college enrollment following World War II. Like most objects of urban renewal, its deeper social meanings become obfuscated by an assignment of direct mechanistic purpose, in this case, higher education. As Rosalind Deutsch poses in Evictions, quote, "To assert in the language of common sense that an urban space refers unequivocally to intrinsic uses is to claim that the city itself speaks, that individual locations within the city and the spatial organization of the city as a whole contain an inherent meaning determined by the imperative to fulfill needs presupposed to be natural, simply practical. By citing the growth of enrollment as a primary impetus for the university's construction, the deliberate destruction of poor communities of color is seen as a natural development in an economic system. It robs the university of a role in the spatial reconstruction of Chicago during urban renewal, which explicitly aimed to maintain the racial economic integrity or white wealth of the city center." That was loud. Today, as if the project of urban renewal had ended as soon as it begun, we continue to prioritize the educational function of universities out of all others. We prioritize this function despite the fact the university continues to expand its campus and accumulate capital. But the process of reconstruction, which began with the clearing of the near west side, has since expanded and continues to displace lower income people. Like the project of settler colonialism from which it draws its mechanism of expropriation, gentrification has no foreseeable end on its own terms. But sitting here, I think we have to appreciate the irony of critiquing the university from within its own walls, especially as students, faculty, and staff whose work is cited as justifications for the university's corporate structure. Most of the functions which make universities good are performed by us, as learners, as writers, as makers, or agents in a community. But do the violent corporate structures of a university undermine our work here? In a situation where the overwhelming majority of its students are direly in debt and where most of its faculty are underpaid, does the context of university classroom undermine the material import of taking subjects like history or cultural studies seriously? I feel like it's beginning to. But more importantly, that we have a responsibility to push back and reform. And that's what I have.